Hey everyone, in the shop here with the B48D. I wanted to make a quick little video on some of the parts that we make for this and some of the interesting features while I've got it on the engine stand here. So here we go. So this, as I said, is a B48D. It is slated for car number 7, B46-7. It is a junkyard engine. I believe we got this one from Straight 6 Auto. We try and stick with a couple junkyards to get these that we trust. And, you know, one of the cool things about getting these engines, since they're from a 2020 and newer BMW, is they're pretty fresh no matter what. So we don't really do a lot to them. Everything is external. We don't have to really change any gaskets. I mean, on some of them we do. It just depends on what happened to the car before we got the engine. But as you can see, this engine is in extremely good shape. So yeah, we just take it and add some parts to it. So to cover this, first part I will start with is the intake manifold here. These are water intercooled engines. So there is a intercooler stack that goes in here, like a core. It's about this wide. And this is the outlet for the water. There's an inlet underneath, which is a little different than the previous engine. The B motor had an inlet outlet here. We actually find that the direction of the water travel through this one tends to make it a little more consistent on the engine tuning when you're trying to run high power levels. So we actually, on these, this manifold is good up to about 350 wheel horsepower on track, depending on the fuel you're running. You can actually, you know, it can make more for drag racing and stuff like that, but for road racing where you're doing, 20-minute sessions, 30-minute sessions, or endurance racing, this is sufficient up to about 350 wheel horsepower. So we don't have a charge pipe on here right now, but the air coming out of the turbo is up to about 100 Celsius when we're running our normal B46 ST2 power level, which is 330 at the wheels to up to 340 depending on the car weight. So that air coming out is 100 Celsius, and then after it goes through here, it's about typically 45 to 50 Celsius. It really depends on ambient temps, of course. So there's actually a sensor that's supposed to be here typically, and it is reading the air temp afterwards. And we have another temp sensor up here that's reading the air temp, so we can actually see make sure the intercooler is working and see how efficient it is. When we are running a little higher power level, we have an extra part that we add. There are some companies that make aluminum manifolds with bigger cores, but we actually do a 2-stage thing. We're working on that to come out. Because when we're running about 400 plus wheel horsepower, the air coming out of the turbo is more like 140 Celsius, and this really can't keep up. It also, interestingly, will start melting things inside the throttle when you're running that kind of power. So moving on here, we've got, obviously, this is the fuel pressure rail, high pressure rail, and high pressure pump over here. This pump, this is a very interesting thing, probably going to put up a little diagram of it. But the way these work, this engine is running at high load, 35 megapascals of pressure, which I think is about 5,000 PSI. And this pump, the way it works is up here, this is the fuel pressure sensor. So we're actively monitoring that high pressure, and it's a closed loop system. We control it. And this little thing right here is a solenoid that tells this pump when to turn on, because underneath it's a mechanical pump. So there's 4 lobes on the exhaust cam that move this pump up and down, but it's not always on. This activates a plunger inside here that makes it so it can actually produce pressure. It's not on all the time. You activate it at a very specific spot on a cam lobe. So as the cam lobe is ramping up, you will calculate when to activate this based on the volume of fuel you need, and then it'll pressurize the rail. So as I said, at high load, we're running about 5,000 PSI, 35 megapascals. At idle, it's like 10 megapascals. And you have to do a lot of calibration to get this to work right and to not break it. It does have a bleed off valve inside though. If you go past 40 megapascals, it will bleed off. And what's interesting is when you're at high RPM, as you come off the throttle, this thing is already calculating how much volume you need. It might already be on a cam lobe once you activate the solenoid inside here, you can't turn it off. It is on. So if you are requesting a large volume of fuel, it's starting it at the beginning of each cam lobe. But if you come off throttle right in that moment, it keeps pumping, and so the rail pressure goes quite high until you're able to need fuel again. Because once you off throttle, it's not injecting any fuel, so you just hold that high rail pressure. So it does have a little blow off valve inside of there. Right now, as you can see here, we don't have a turbo on this. This is one of our CNC motor mounts, and we like these PowerFlex motor mounts. They have they're an encapsulated thing, so if they break, it won't destroy or won't come apart, but gives us just enough damping and NVH reduction, but still holds the motor solidly in place. The turbo is actually over here for this guy. We'll do another video on this one later, but yeah, so one other thing that's interesting about this. So the crank pulley on this, I don't know if you can see, but I am able to move this by hand back and forth. We've actually had some issues on the D engines with the sequential, where it has very hard shifts, very rapid shifts, I should say. They're not necessarily hard, but this changes speed very rapidly, and it's turning. Normally the alternator goes here. This is the water pump. We've deleted the AC. But this guy, under rapid changes, there's a big layer of rubber underneath here. Does not seem to be able to hold up necessarily. So we think we have a solution for that, but it's not an issue on the manual cars, only an issue with the sequential cars. But that guy was not quite made for what we're doing to these things. Coming around the back here, so the timing chain on a B48D, or B48 in general, is on the back. Same as BMW's diesel cars. This engine actually shares a lot of parts with the modern diesel, and obviously with the B58, the 6-cylinder version of this. So these are the vanos solenoids. These control the variable valve timing in the engine. Very simple system now on these compared to what all the previous generations of cars. Every generation since they really came out with that, with the infinitely variable valve timing on, I think, the S54. Maybe the Euro motor of that was the first version, but in the US, I think the S54 or S62 were the first ones. And that could be wrong, but that's what I think. And that system on the S54 is very complicated, hard to time. This thing is ridiculously easy. These can actually just pop off if you want. They have these little tabs, and they just kind of fall out. So all the timing chain stuff is on the back. The D motor has a single timing chain. The B motor had two. I haven't necessarily seen that there's a difference. We are taking these up to 7,300 RPM at this point. I keep raising it a little bit. We like lots of revs on the racetrack. I think stock is 6,500. Have seen that supposedly these are limited to 7,000 RPM, but again, so far they've been holding up just fine. So coming around the bottom here, so we add this dipstick so we can actually properly check oil level and rapidly. There's a nice little port in the oil pan that we drill, and we also, you can't see it, there's an oil pan baffle that we've added in here for oiling. But one of the nice things about this engine is it's very short. It's a 4-cylinder, so oiling is not that big of a deal. It maintains good oil pressure. It does have, actually, I don't know if we'll be able to see it in here. The oil pressure on these is also variable, and it's controlled by a solenoid. So I can, in the Motec, I'm actually controlling the oil pressure at any given RPM and load. Also, speaking of oil, we make this part for these. Our oil block normally there's a water to oil heat exchanger there. We put some fittings on here. This will go out to an oil cooler on the front of the car just to get more cooling into it when you're running a bunch of power. And let's see here. And then obviously our motor mount for this side, we make that as well. And one other pretty interesting thing on this, so this is a thermostat. It's huge, but there's a ball valve in there that is controlled. You can move it, so I have to control it with Motec, but it is a dual H-bridge system. So there's a bunch of, that thing feeds water to a variety of places. It's kind of dark, so it's a little bit hard to see right here, but this is the control mechanism for it. It's a big unit, and we have to control that to set the water temp in the car. So you can, if you want, you can make it, you know, at idle, have the thing run at 150 Fahrenheit or 140 or whatever, but it's settable for RPM and load, which works, you know, very useful in a street car, less necessary for what we're doing. Usually when we're on track, that thing on a hot day, that's just fully open. But it also has the position sensor for that thing uses what's called a sense signal, which is, I believe stands for serial enabled nibble transmission, which I think that's a play on byte. But fortunately, Motec firmware is able to interpret that signal, so I can know the position of that thing and control it appropriately. So on the front here, this is another thing. The Valtronic is, I don't know if you're familiar with Valtronic, it's a variable valve lift system. We make this little part right here that locks it out to full lift. We chose not to use this. This guy is actually this tiny little engine, this tiny little motor will change the valve lift on the motor between 0.2-ish millimeters and I think about 10 mil. We just lock it out at full lift, as I said. But this is a 3-phase AC motor. It's not a 12-volt DC, so there must be a voltage converter in the stock ECU. Originally, we wanted to use it, and then we researched it and figured out that basically there was very, not worth the effort at all. We don't really care because Valtronic is meant more for very partial load and idle fuel efficiency. Doesn't play much of a role in what we're doing. So that's the basics of the B48D. I am working on a longer video that's a little more technical, a lot more numbers and info deeper in the engine. Let me know in the comments if you're interested in anything specific to what we're doing or specifics of this engine. And thank you for watching.